Good evening, everybody. Welcome, people who are walking in. Welcome, take a seat. Welcome to Studium Generale by the University of Utrecht. My name is Siep Vaas, or for English speakers, Sip Vaes. And I am a program maker at Studium Generale, where we make discussions, talks, lectures, or we produce them. We organize them to broaden our horizons and deepen our perspectives. And we can't guarantee you that you will walk out with more answers than questions, but I think you can handle that, right? All right, good. This is the third evening in the series Beyond Capitalism, in which we explore alternatives for capitalism, or we invite prominent scientists from the Netherlands and abroad to share their ideas on capitalism and how it can be changed to make it more fair for everybody. The first two evenings in this series were in September and December of 2025. The first one was about the question if there can be prosperity without growth. And the second one was tackled the question how we can set up companies in a more democratic order. Now on to tonight. Is there anyone who thinks that capitalism doesn't need any changing at all? Raise your hand. Get out. I'm kidding. But maybe there isn't a good alternative, or maybe there is one, but we just haven't found it yet. Before I say anything else, I'm already noticing that I'm stuttering a bit. That's because I'm not a native English speaker, so excuse me for that beforehand. On to tonight. If you are in this room, or if you're watching at home, hello to you too, you can ask questions to our speakers. So in this room, please remember your questions, and if you're watching at home, you can type them through the chat. Now, does anyone know what this is? It's the Johan Cruyff Arena. It's very good. It's the biggest soccer stadium in the Netherlands. It's named after Johan Cruyff, the famous soccer player who once said, "Je moet schieten, anders kan je niet scoren." You have to shoot, otherwise you can't score. It's truly one of our brightest minds. And if we were to fit this stadium with the richest 56,000 people on planet Earth, how much money would the average person make, you think? Just shout a guess. 500 million. 100 million. More. A billion. Ding, ding, ding. That's right. 56,000 people on average, one person would make 1 billion euros. Now that's a very rich stadium, but how rich compared to other people on this planet? Well, The Guardian put that into perspective with data from the World Inequality Report. This isn't a green screen. This is a screen filled with dots, and each dot represents one stadium. This is 2.8 billion people fit into football stadiums, soccer stadiums. This is how many stadiums you would need to match 1/3 of what the richest 56,000 people on Earth make. And it's a bit complicated, but just to put it into other words, the richest 56,000 people on this planet own 3 times as much as the poorest half of humanity. Right? Isn't that insane? And that's what this evening is about that gap of inequality. And we are going to tackle the question, how can it be more equal? I'm not going to do that. These people, or not these people, the richest 56,000 people, they have trillions of euros, but we tonight have Ingrid Robeyns and Stuart White. And they are two brilliant speakers who are going to share their ideas on alternatives for capitalism with us. Stuart is going to give a lecture. Then afterwards, Ingrid is going to reflect on that lecture. And then I would like to give you at home the opportunity to ask questions. Now, Stuart White, who is that? Stuart White is associate professor at the University of Oxford. His ideas reject both capitalism and authoritarian forms of socialism, and he focuses somewhere in between. He wrote a book, The Wealth of Freedom. It's right here. And it has something to do with radical Republican political economy. Now I know what you think, what, a Republican? No, it's something else, but I'll let him explain. Please give a warm round of applause for Stuart White.
There we go. Now you can hear me, yes. Well, thank you for that very generous introduction, and thanks to Professor Ingrid Robeyns and the Visions of the Future project at the University of Utrecht for the invitation to speak this evening. Thanks to Erwin and Zip for their support. And to all of you for being here on a very cold, wintry night to come out to listen to people speak. Before I get into the lecture proper, I would just like to take a moment to acknowledge the sad news today of the passing of the Reverend Jesse Jackson, the US Democrat politician and campaigner for racial justice and social justice, economic justice more widely. I wish more leaders had his vision. May he rest in power. So, whoops, wrong way. Today I'm going to speak on the topic of what is a fair economy, drawing on the book, The Wealth of Freedom, which came out last year. I'll say a little bit to clarify what the word republicanism here means. If you're thinking Donald Trump, he's a Republican, in a way that's quite useful because republicanism, as I mean it, is kind of the opposite of Donald Trump. So think of Trump and then think of the opposite. And I have a quote to start with. A quote from the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau from his 1762 book, The Social Contract, in which he says, "When it comes to wealth, no citizen should be rich enough to buy another, and none so poor that he has to sell himself." So what Rousseau is saying here is that in designing an economy, we need to set it up so there is both an economic ceiling, none should be rich enough to buy another, and there needs also to be a robust economic floor. None should be so poor that he has to sell himself. And I think what Rousseau means there is sell their wage labor to someone else. So this is quite a radical thought. None should be so poor that they're forced to sell their ability to work. Before I move on, the picture here is from the first page of the original edition of Rousseau's The Social Contract. And you can see the figure of justice there. And if you look at the feet of justice, to her right, you can see a cat. And this is because Rousseau was very fond of cats. He thought of them as embodying liberty. And as anybody who's lived with a cat knows, there's some truth in this, and that a cat, if it lives with you, chooses to live with you. And cats can just walk away, often causing, as I can attest, a lot of stress to their humans when they do that. But this idea of the power to walk away, or what the philosopher Carl Wiederquist calls the power to say no. That's going to be very important in this lecture. I think when we're trying to think about what a robust economic floor is, it's in large part about people having the resources to walk away from relationships and the power, as Wiederquist would put it, the power to say no. So in the course of this lecture, I'm going to talk about how we might institute a robust economic floor, and I'll also allude to the question of how we might institutionalize that ceiling. But for the bulk of what I have to say, I'm going to talk more about the floor. But before I get into how we might go about implementing the floor or the ceiling, I want to say a bit more about what might motivate the thought that Rousseau puts on the table, the thought that we need, that we ought to have a ceiling and a floor to personal wealth. And to get at that, I want to contrast two kinds of question that we might ask about the economy. The first is a question which I think dominates our politics. The question, is this good for the economy? Politics, it seems to me, as it's practiced, certainly in the UK, is driven by that question. And it's an important question. I don't mean to deny that. But I think there is another more basic prior question. The question, what is the economy for? The first question, in a sense, makes politics the servant of the economy. This question, I think, brings home to us that the economy isn't ultimately something that exists kind of for its own sake, or that we exist for its sake. Rather, the economy should be in our service. It's something that should be doing something for us. What is that? Well, the way I approach answering that question in the book, The Wealth of Freedom, is to come back to this social contract tradition, which Rousseau, pictured there again, belongs to. And in that tradition, which I would also call a civic republican tradition, in using the word republican in its true sense, I think, the way we start answering that question, what is the economy for, is we think in terms of the common good. The economy is there to service our common good. And in the social contract tradition, we think of the common good in terms of interests that as individuals we have in common, shared basic interests in life, welfare, opportunity, and not least in liberty. So when we try and answer the question, what is the economy for? Part of the answer, an important part of the answer, is that it has to be designed to generate goods and services in a way that respects and protects our interest in liberty. And Rousseau, in another one of his works, The Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, gives us, I think, some insight into what liberty is when he says that the worst thing that can happen in relations between men is to find oneself at the mercy of another. This idea, I think, is very much at the center of a current of thought in contemporary academic political theory, a current that often refers to itself as republicanism, which says that we should think of freedom as the status of, to use the technical term, non-domination. This is an idea developed by the philosopher Philip Pettit in his book Republicanism, which is pictured there. So on this view, we are unfree when some other party has a power over us to interfere as they wish, according to their discretion, in our life. And we have no capacity to control how that power is directed over us. So we are, to use Rousseau's phrase, at the mercy of another. So freedom, by contrast, is the status of non-domination, when nobody has that power to interfere at will, arbitrarily, without any control in how we live. Now, domination, as I've just described it, is something which, as we'll get into later in the lecture, it's something which is very much an interpersonal phenomenon. For example, we might think of it as something which arises in the relationship between a worker and employer. In certain situations, the power dynamic there is one where an employer has the power to dominate a worker, a power of arbitrary interference. Or perhaps it arises in the household. And I'll come back to that. But I think also, as well as that, what for the moment I'll call that interpersonal notion of domination, we also need, when we're thinking about liberty and what it means to be free, we also need to take into account what we might call political domination. The fact that even in formally democratic societies, the rich exercise disproportionate power within political life. And there's therefore a sense in which the rest of us as citizens are subject to a degree of domination by the very rich, who are able to use their wealth to find ways to intervene in the policy-making process, the law-making process, in ways that we can't fully control. A power of interference that they exercise according to their will and discretion. So, to just sum up where we've got to, I've suggested that we need to start from the question, what is an economy for? And we then need to ask what the common good consists in, and I've suggested that centrally, it's about our shared interest in liberty, and that liberty is about non-domination, not being subject to a power of arbitrary interference, and we can be dominated interpersonally in many of our social interactions, and we can be dominated politically. So putting all that together, my claim is that an economy of the common good, to deliver on freedom, to deliver on non-domination, has to protect us. It has to make reasonable attempts to protect us both from domination interpersonally and political domination. And that is why I think we come back to Rousseau's idea of an economic floor and an economic ceiling. The ceiling, I think, helps, for example, in relation to political domination. And the floor, which I'll focus on for most of the rest of this lecture, the floor is hugely important in protecting us from interpersonal domination. So let me now elaborate that thought a little further. So let's say you're in a situation, you're a worker, let's say, and you are dependent on a particular employer for the income you need to meet your basic needs. And let's assume you have no realistic alternative to this employer and that they do not depend on you in the same way or to the same extent. In that situation, we have an imbalance of power which makes you, the worker, vulnerable to domination. You need urgently this opportunity that the employer has. You can't pass that up. They can easily pass your labour up. They can get a replacement for you in the situation I'm imagining. And they can leverage that inequality between the two of you to exercise power when you make a contract, make the contract on their terms, to dictate terms, as we might say. And the contract that you enter into might well be one which gives them arbitrary power in the workplace once you've signed the contract. So one thing that makes us vulnerable to domination, to a lack of liberty in that sense, is our vulnerability around our basic needs. And so this gives rise to the thought that one thing that we need to do, crucially, to try and protect people from vulnerability to domination, is to try and create some set of policies or institutions which relieve the pressure on people to do things like scramble into jobs to meet their basic needs, to end the situation of what we might call basic needs vulnerability. And one idea which is very suggestive in this respect, and I think worth serious consideration, is the idea of universal basic income, or UBI, a periodic cash income grant paid to every individual without any test of means or willingness to work. Why does this help? Well, the advocates of UBI argue that if everybody has a UBI and it's at a sufficiently high level, a level at or close to that we need to meet our basic needs, then this goes a long way to remove that desperation, that urgency to find a job to meet your basic needs. You now have an income as of right which you can use to meet those basic needs. And so that situation that I sketched out a moment ago, in a sense, that situation is prevented right at its root. The situation begins with me, the worker, relying on an employer to give me the wage that I need to satisfy my basic needs. But with the UBI in place, then I'm no longer dependent on an employer in the same way, and I'm therefore less vulnerable to domination. And advocates of UBI would argue that it's not just in the employment context that this argument has relevance or force. So let's imagine we're in a traditional heterosexual gendered household, a male husband earning a wage, a financially dependent wife. Here again, because of that financial dependency, we have an inequality that can be leveraged into a situation of domination. But if everybody in the household has a UBI, and consequently they're more able to walk away from the relationship, then that can change the power dynamics within the household and perhaps thereby prevent, mitigate the risk of domination within the household. A UBI might also reduce our risk of domination at the hands of state bureaucrats or in other economic situations such as in credit markets. So advocates of UBI argue that it's a very fecund, a very productive policy in terms of the range of situations in which it will protect us from being vulnerable to power inequalities that would result in domination. And there are a number of people who, in political philosophy, who've spelt out this kind of argument for UBI, what's sometimes called the Republican argument for UBI, because it appeals to this Republican understanding of freedom as non-domination. Daniel Raventós and David Casasas being two political theorists who've made this kind of argument. Now, the critics will say, nevertheless, that there are limits to UBI here. And three areas of criticism which I'll put on the table for our consideration this evening. One is about the level of UBI. So the critics say, well, that story you just told about how UBI allows people to just, walk away from various relationships, employment, or the household. That story assumed that the UBI was set at a high level in relation to the poverty line, what people need to satisfy their basic needs. We're talking about a universal basic income that is high enough to meet people's basic needs, or at least a standard set of those basic needs. But what if the UBI is lower than that, as it may realistically have to be? Is it still going to have that kind of effect in reducing the risk of domination? And a moment ago, when I was talking about a UBI high enough to meet basic needs, I added in this phrase, a standard set of basic needs. Well, of course, that's me trying clumsily to acknowledge that actually our needs as individuals vary enormously. And if you're paying a uniform cash grant to everybody, even if it's at a relatively high level, that might be good enough to meet some people's basic needs, but it's not going to be high enough to meet everybody's basic needs because our needs vary so much according to our circumstances, and some people, therefore, will not have crucial needs met, even by a high UBI, and they will remain vulnerable to domination as a result. So that's a second criticism. And a third, which I think often connects back to the first, is that this is just too utopian. It's a lovely thought experiment, a world where everybody has an unconditional income at a level sufficient to meet a standard set of basic needs. But that's so far removed from where we are. In the UK today, if you think about moving to that scenario from where we are with our present social security system, so much means testing, so much heavy, draconian, punitive work testing, it seems so far removed as to be utopian in a bad sense. Almost demotivating to think that it's so far away, it's unattainable. And therefore, maybe this whole UBI idea is a distraction from what we really need to be doing. It's too utopian. So I'm going to say a little bit in response to these three criticisms, but I'm really going to focus mainly on this charge of utopianism. I'll say a little bit first in response to the first two criticisms. So the criticism about the level, so the argument is, unless you've got a UBI at quite a high level, then this argument about it reducing vulnerability to domination doesn't really apply. I mean, I think there's a lot to that criticism, but before we just sort of wave it through as a valid criticism, we ought to note there is some evidence from at least one real-world basic income experiment that I know of, which suggests that even a UBI somewhat below a basic needs or a poverty threshold can work to reduce people's domination. So there was a basic income experiment in Madhya Pradesh in India around little over 10 years ago, studied by Sarat Davala and his colleagues. The basic income there was set at about 1/3 of the local poverty line, and the researchers found that through its various effects in empowering economic activity, it reduced things like indebtedness. So on a number of variables, it looked like it was doing things that are consistent with reducing people's vulnerability to domination. So yeah, the level matters, and the higher it is, the more plausible this story about reducing domination, the risk of domination is. But let's not dismiss the gains that might be got even from lower levels of basic income. The second criticism about variation in need, I think we just have to accept this as an absolutely valid criticism. And what it shows is that although a UBI may be important, very important, to creating this robust economic floor, it can't be the whole story. We are going to need things like high-quality public services in areas like healthcare, as well as a UBI, if we're going to create a robust economic floor. So I think it's an argument against people who think that we should have a free market economy plus a UBI and then just let things go from there. I think this criticism suggests that a UBI alone is not going to give you that robust economic floor. So let me now turn then to this criticism that the UBI is just utopian, unhelpfully utopian as an idea. Now here I think I'd want to make a distinction between bad and good utopianisms. So I think utopianism is bad when it sets us a goal which is not immediately realizable, but we're being told that what we need to do is somehow immediately introduce this utopian objective. But I think there's a good utopianism, which is when we have an idea, we have a proposal, and we treat this as something that we need practically and pragmatically to work towards. In this sense, a utopia is, I think it was E.P. Thompson who said, utopias educate desire. And what I want to argue is that, well, maybe an immediate transition to a UBI set at a high level, maybe that's not feasible. I don't know the situation in the Netherlands, but I would certainly think that in the UK, we're not in a political space where that kind of transition is feasible anytime soon. But nevertheless, I think we can still use that vision of a UBI set at a generous high level to educate our political desire and to use it to think about a direction of travel. And the main thing I'd like to talk about in the rest of the lecture is thinking of UBI as this direction of travel, not as something to be implemented tomorrow in full, but as a sort of guide to more modest, though I think still quite demanding, policy changes. And I'm going to put sort of three ideas on the table here as part of this idea of using UBI as a direction of travel. One of them is going to be the thought that we should use plural policy instruments or institutions to try and institute a UBI. One of them is that we should think about the benefits of a negative income tax as well as a UBI in the strict sense. And the third one, which I'll get to, is thinking about how we might not abolish the work test in the social security system, but try to democratize it. So the first of those ideas is the idea that we should think pluralistically about the tools and institutions we use to get to a UBI or something a lot like it. So obviously one tool we might want to use and probably have to use is the tax benefit system. But I think it's important to see that that is only one tool. A second tool we might use is to think of UBI as what is sometimes called a social dividend. So let's imagine we're living in a country which has some kind of collective investment fund, like the state of Alaska has the Alaska Permanent Fund, based on funds that come from the use of minerals in Alaska. Let's say we've got a collective investment fund like that, then every year this collective investment has a return, and one thing we can do with some of that return is we can just pay it out to people, as the Alaskans do, as a uniform income grant. You know, if you're a resident of Alaska, every year the Alaskan state sends you a check, each and every individual resident, that represents your share of this collective investment fund. Well, lots of countries have sovereign wealth funds, and many countries that don't could start to build up a sovereign wealth fund. I've referenced two books here. Stuart Lansley's book, A Sharing Economy, discusses how the UK might set up a citizens' wealth fund, build it up over time, and use the dividend to pay out a UBI. And Angela Kamine's book, Citizens' Wealth, is a book which looks around the world at sovereign wealth funds and argues both for more democratic control over those funds and, if you like, greater inclusivity or democracy in the use of the return on those funds, like paying out the return as a UBI, as a cash income grant. And a third possibility here, another way that we might try and get towards something like a UBI, would be to work on the distribution of private wealth. So if you have your own private assets and you get an income from them, that is akin to a UBI, at least in the sense that it gives you a source of income independent of having to sell your labor power. So if there are policies we can do, like generous subsidies to support saving amongst poorer households, then that too is working towards the goal of creating something like a UBI. So let's use all of these tools, not just the tax and benefit system. The second idea I have for treating UBI as a direction of travel is to think in terms of striking a compromise around negative income tax. So for those who are unfamiliar with the idea, a negative income tax is a tax transfer scheme in which if your income is above a certain level, you pay tax. But if it's below a certain level, then the state pays you something. And typically, the state would be paying you income in order to bring your income up to some minimum threshold. So a negative income tax is a way of trying to, or it can be, a way of trying to guarantee everybody some minimum level of income. But you're doing that not just by giving everybody the same uniform cash grant, but in a much more targeted way, you're trying to lift the income of people specifically on low incomes up to closer to the minimum income threshold. Now, UBI proponents are often very critical of negative income tax, and there are good reasons to be critical of it compared to UBI. For example, the payment, there's a risk of underpayment or overpayment typically, and that can create a lot of stress for low-income households. But I think negative income tax may have some advantages over UBI in terms of political feasibility. And in addition, we have some evidence from experiments with negative income tax schemes which suggest that at least some of the things we want to get out of a UBI, we can also get out of a negative income tax. There's been a lot of work on a Canadian negative income tax experiment in the 1980s, which shows that the negative income tax had positive outcomes in terms of health and in terms of workers' bargaining power. So if, as I'm speculating, a negative income tax is more politically feasible and it gives us some of what we want, then maybe it's worth thinking in terms of a negative income tax, not necessarily to the exclusion of a UBI, but as something we use for a period as we're trying to move towards that long-term utopian vision of a UBI set at a level sufficient to meet a standard set of basic needs. So we might have an interim period where we have a very low UBI, not enough to live off, maybe coming from a citizen wealth fund, and we top that up using a negative income tax. And then thirdly, if our social security system, our negative income tax, still has a work test attached to it, so we're still conditioning the cash payment on people looking for a job and showing that they're looking for a job, well, maybe we should think about not abolishing the work test, but loosening it or democratizing the design of the work test. Certainly in the UK, my impression is that the work test, rules around looking for work in the social security system are set with very little effective voice coming from the people who actually have to live under those rules. And that looks suspiciously like a case of domination. So one thing we could work for would be the democratization of setting those rules around the work test, giving the people who are going to be subject to those rules more say in what they look like. So yes, UBI set at a generous level looks, certainly to me in the UK right now, to be politically unfeasible. But I still think it can function helpfully as an ideal to work towards. It sets a direction of travel, and we can move in that direction thinking about the range of tools there are to get there, not just the tax benefit system, but things like a citizen wealth fund, policies to achieve a more egalitarian distribution of private assets. We can think about the role that a negative income tax might play in a long-term transition, and we could think about democratizing the work test rather than simply abolishing it. So that's how I would respond to the utopian criticism. I've got about 5 minutes left, a little over 5 minutes. So I'll just say a little bit about some other ideas, which I think might also come into thinking about a robust economic floor. And one of them is the idea of basic capital, the idea that we should give everybody, perhaps early in their adult life, a capital grant, a lump sum, to launch ambitiously into your adult life. This is an idea that Tom Paine set out in his pamphlet Agrarian Justice, 1797. And he uses the language of beginning the world. He thinks that we should all we all have an interest in beginning the world, launching ambitiously into life. And he argues that every man and woman in the UK should be paid a basic capital to help them begin the world. And in my own work, I've argued for what I call a citizen inheritance, a basic capital grant linked to inheritance tax, where we tax a proportion of the wealth that's transferred over generations, and we use that to finance or help finance a basic capital. Now, you might say if we have a UBI, we don't need basic capital, because surely somebody could just turn their UBI into a capital grant. If you can just take your UBI to a financial institution and, in a sense, sign it off to them in return for a capital sum, you can capitalize your basic income. Advocates of UBI are generally very suspicious, if not hostile, of that idea that we should be free to capitalize our UBI. And I can see why they're worried about that. I share that worry, because if somebody capitalizes their lifetime UBI and then they blow their capital, then the material part of that robust economic floor that we're trying to create will have disappeared for that individual. We'll be back to that basic needs vulnerability we were trying to get rid of. But I wonder if that means we should have zero freedom to mortgage or capitalize our UBI. I think there's also a freedom-related interest we have in being able to marshal resources rapidly, to pursue valued personal projects, whether it's a business idea or whether it's you just want to travel around the world a bit to get some inspiration. So maybe there's a case for some limited freedom to capitalize your basic income. I'm just going to put that thought on the table. And all of this has been about the floor, the robust economic floor. But in concluding, I want to point back to the project, the complementary project of thinking about the ceiling. This is something that Professor Robeyns, who's going to talk in a moment, has made very much the focus of her work, her brilliant book, libertarianism, which argues for that there ought to be, morally speaking, a limit to extreme wealth, a wealth ceiling. And obviously one policy instrument we might use there, which is worth more discussion, is a wealth tax. But in closing, I think what I'd also like to put on the table is some good old-fashioned trade unionism. Now, trade unionism matters in part because it helps us with that robust economic floor. If you're an individual worker, a union gives you further protection in your workplace against domination by an employer. That's why I'm a member of a union. But also, I think we should think about how trade unionism at the societal level can affect the distribution of power and influence. Trade unionism offers the potential for people to exert a countervailing power to that of the very rich in political life. Is it an accident that the growing power of the rich in countries like the United States comes at a time or after a long period in which trade unionism has been in decline? And the kind of key point I think to make here is that decline of trade unionism, which we see in the US, which we see in the UK, that's not, I think, to be seen as something that's inevitable. I think it's a function of law and policy, and there are laws and policies we can change to promote trade unionism. And in the book, I argue for what I call the promotive stance, for thinking about how to calibrate labour law and public policy to promote trade unionism, not only for the benefit of individual workers in their workplace, but as a tool for political equality to push back against the political domination of the rich. So to sum up, I think we need to start from the question, what is an economy for? Part of the answer to that is we need an economy to be structured in a way that delivers on liberty and prevents domination. That is going to require a robust economic floor and a robust ceiling. I think a UBI has an important place in building a robust floor. And there is a direction of travel we can plausibly, pragmatically follow to get towards the ideal of a UBI set at a level, set at a reasonably high and generous level. I hope I've also given a sense that there is a lot of academic research out there on all of these ideas. If somebody says, well, we don't really know how to build an alternative to neoliberal capitalism, either they're ignorant or they're lying. There is a lot of research on this. There's a lot of ideas about how we could build that floor and build that ceiling. So politics, our democratic politics, shouldn't accept the economy as it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stuart, for that lecture. Yes, there's the remote. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Yes, I think so too. Ingrid Robeyns is going to reflect on these ideas and talk about libertarianism. This is the book that she wrote. She holds the chair of ethics of institutions at the Utrecht University and also the Ethics Institute. Oh, switch off the... before we hear the clicking. Mm. Yes, thank you. Perfect. Ingrid Robeyns holds the chair of Ethics of Institutions here at the University of Utrecht and also the Ethics Institute. Between 1997 and 2022, she led the Fair Limits project in which she and her colleagues explored the moral limits to moral reasons for ecological and economic limits. I think you can explain it much better than I can. Please give a warm round of applause for Ingrid Robeyns.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Stuart, for really a fascinating and very clear account of the questions we have around the economy. I think I'm here also standing as one of the 4 team members of the Visions of the Future project, which is studying the question, what, if anything, should follow neoliberal capitalism, which is not the same question as what is following neoliberal capitalism, because that is actually another thing. And we have on the 13th of March, we have a talk in the university library on Muskism. So if you want to know more about what actually is following neoliberal capitalism, come to that talk. I'm going to give a couple of comments on Stuart's presentation, basically just adding some stuff and in the end putting something about the Dutch context. And I'll start from the most abstract to the more concrete. The most abstract I want to say is that I think when we reason as philosophers or as theorists about these questions, what is really crucial is the question, what are the values or the goals that we really want to protect? And so in Stuart's presentation, it was clear that non-domination and liberty are crucial, but of course, having your basic needs met is needed in order to not to be dominated. So these things hang together. But there are other values that I think we could have, that we have reasons to want to promote or to protect. There is well-being beyond material needs. There is, I think we underestimate the importance of mental health in our societies and avoidable stress. Many people have levels of unnecessary stress. Of course, stress is to some extent good and it's normal, but there are too many people with levels of stress that are unhealthy and also, I think, related to how we've organized the economy. And then there's, of course, what Stuart also touched upon at the end, the question about how the economic system influences democracy. Now, what is interesting is, if you look at debates about the economy in our newspaper, it's all about efficiency or effectiveness. So the interesting thing is, the economists ask different questions, or the policymakers, they ask, not all policymakers, I should say, they ask, is it good for the economy? But then we should also really force ourselves and force our politicians and force our policymakers and force our economists to ask the questions, which are the values at stake? And efficiency is not a value in itself, because efficiency is always efficiency of something, and most of the time it is efficiency of welfare creation, whereby welfare is material stuff, so welfare in the sense of koopkracht, as we say in Dutch. And that means that on that argument, actually, some economists are against UBI because they say it's a very inefficient way to pull people out of poverty. So I think those who are in favor of UBI will have to confront that argument also head on. So the importance about starting with values and goals, which is what we also try to do in the Visions for the Future project, is that you could agree about the goals, but then disagree about the means, the policies, the tools, and so forth. And that is important because we actually should first agree about the values, and then we can disagree about the institutions or the policies. And that is also important because, for example, in the case of UBI, you have proponents of UBI who actually are what in philosophy we call libertarian. They want to give full space for the markets. They want, as Stuart said, abolish all the public goods. and then they want this in order to make, for example, markets more liquid, but they have very different values that they want to promote than, say, Stuart or most of the proponents of UBI. So that's a general kind of methodological, philosophical point I want to make, and the other points will be briefer. So I don't want to make you worried that I'm going to take too much time. The second point I want to make is on Stuart's very helpful discussion about seeing UBI as a direction of travel. Of course, with the work I've been doing on limitarianism, I have gotten this critique a lot of times, like this is utopian, it's impossible, you're a communist, whatever. But the thing is, so the term I use, which I am actually assuming is very similar to the idea of a direction of travel, is a regulative ideal. That means an ideal we have reasons to aspire to, even though we know that currently we can't reach that ideal. And it is also not sure that we will ever be able to reach the ideal. Now, why would that be useful? Well, I liked what Stuart said about utopias educate desire, so I think it stretches our imagination. It's also questioning assumptions, and I will come back to that in a second. And it's also, I guess, even if it's not realizable today or tomorrow, when we debate about it as citizens, it's helping us to practice our deliberative skills as citizens. And that is crucially important for democracy, that we form our own opinions in an informed way. And then that could also shift what political scientists call the Overton window, that what is seen as possible, as imaginable. And my experience talking for the last 2 years almost non-stop about limitarianism is that this is actually happening. That there are people who say, okay, this is not going to happen soon, but actually this idea that we may really need limits, that I see that idea becoming more and more accepted as something that is almost unavoidable, also because of, actually, primarily, because of we see what the effects are of the rise of the billionaire class and the harms they do to the rest of the world. So that's basically just expressing my support for how Stuart looks at this and extending it a bit. Then I have a suggestion, which is about the pluralist approach to when you see UBI as a direction of travel and you want to have a pluralist approach with multiple policies. So Stuart helpfully suggested we should have things like tax benefit system, think about social dividend, a wider distribution of private capital. But I actually think we need to add something, and that is we need to critique the ideological assumptions that are behind the current system. So you have materials, rules, fiscal rules, experiments, and then you have what is in our head. So what are the assumptions we have in our head that make us support what we currently have and make us insufficiently question what we have? And I think there is a clear example that applies to both UBI and limitarianism, and that is that we tend, under our current socio-economic and political system, we tend to deny how much luck plays in our life. So luck plays, this is an argument I develop in my book, luck plays really an enormous effect in our life. The parents with whom we are born, social class in which we are born, our health and our genetic makeup with which we are born, and even market luck, they all play such an important role in both people who become hugely successful. This is the guys I'm talking about in my book. Most of them are guys. But also people who actually are really suffering. And because we deny the important role of luck, and instead we point always to individual responsibility, that makes it possible to both say, oh, those billionaires, they deserve it. And it also makes it possible to say, those who actually do not have, they're not able to meet their basic needs, they must have made some wrong decisions. So I think one of the ideological shifts we need to make is how we look at ourselves as human beings. Our self-understanding needs to change. And that is, I think, also part of what we need in this pluralist approach towards either implementing UBI or limitarianism or many other, I think, more human-centered proposals for a new economy. And I will end with a concrete suggestion, a proposal, something to perhaps discuss. Ireland has decided that they are going to have a UBI for artists. That's one way in which you could try to move on this path towards extending UBI. Now, I don't know who has read either Trouw or De Groene Amsterdammer last week, but there was an article that in the Netherlands there are 445,000 people who cannot work either due to illness or due to a disability. And they do not receive disability benefits. That's almost 500,000 people who have like no compensation for the fact that they're long-term ill or disabled. Of those 445,000 people, 200,000 are on welfare, bijstand. I don't know what you know about the bijstand, but I consider it a very restricting regime that comes with all sorts of accountability restrictions. You have like, the important difference is being on welfare for a short period of time may be challenging, but you can make it out and then rebuild your life. But if you are on welfare because you're disabled, that means you're going to be on certain types of disability. You're likely to be on welfare for the rest of your life. That means the whole rest of your life, your income will be just around the poverty line. If you have bad luck, something happens, you're in trouble. So I think, and that's 200,000 of them, and then 245,000 of those fellow citizens have no financial support at all. So I would suggest, if we are going to experiment with UBI in the Netherlands, let's start with a UBI for disabled people. It will massively decrease their stress. We actually had something that got quite some distance towards that in the past, namely Wajong. We've abolished it, or almost. Why? Because it was too expensive. And too expensive, I'm not going to say that money falls from the sky, not at all, but too expensive is a political statement about where you do want to devote money to and where you do not want to devote money to. And that means you have to talk about the whole state budget, and then we can also start to talk about other things that we think are important, rather than all those people that previously had at least this aspect of not being dominated, being free of stress, etc., and now are either on welfare or have no source of money at all. So that would be the concrete proposal with which I would like to end, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with Stuart.
Thank you, Ingrid. Yes, you can come up, but don't forget to switch on your microphone again. Now, we've listened to a lot of very interesting ideas. I hope that you have a lot of questions. So if you have one, this is the time. Good, I see a couple of hands going up. I will just go through the room. There's time for multiple people to ask their questions. I'm starting with you. What's your name?
Jasmijn. Hello.
Hi.
Good evening. Hi. First of all, thank you. I think you've made some very interesting points, and especially about the UBI. I think it could be a solution to some of the problems you have addressed. One of the questions I do have, and it might be a bit on the nose, but to what extent do you, maybe based on research that you know of, think that a UBI could decrease the intention of people to work or the motivation to work? And I think it's that there is a group that might fall in that category. For example, the group that would, if they were to work, gain an income that would be close to the UBI. And how would you then motivate these people? Because, you know, I don't want to open the discussion about how to finance the UBI, but I think you would need like a working population to balance that out. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you. Should I?
If you want to,
go ahead. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Yeah, well, great question. I mean, yeah, it's impossible to put the idea of UBI out there without, I mean, you're doing this kind of radical thing. You're giving people an income, ideally at a level sufficient to meet a standard set of basic needs, and you're not requiring them to work. And so, yeah, there are lots of questions that arise from that severing of the link between a basic needs income and work. One set of questions is about the motivation to work and the sort of financial stability or sustainability of the UBI scheme. There are also justice-related questions that come out of that. Is something unfair? Is there something unfair about somebody getting a UBI and choosing not to do work when they're capable of doing so? I spent way too much time in the early part of my career thinking about that ethical objection, because if you come out of a certain socialist tradition in which there's a really strong emphasis on, the worker and justice for the worker, UBI can seem like the wrong path to take, because what you want as that kind of socialist egalitarian is a fair deal for workers, and UBI looks like it's maybe not doing that. So there are lots of questions related to this concern about work. I guess I would want to go partly empirical and look at the basic income experiments that have been done and look at the magnitude of the work effects that we see there. Of course, we have to be careful about the conclusions we draw from basic income experiments, because they're experiments, they're short-term, so the behavioural effects might be different than they would be under a UBI that people thought was there for good. But so far as we have evidence on this, I mean, my reading of it is that there are a lot of experiments around versions of negative income tax in the global north context, North America, the one I mentioned in Canada, which show modest negative effect, a modest contraction of labour supply as a result of the negative income tax. But it's not clear that that's a bad thing. I mean, how much work do we think people should be doing to start with? I mean, again, we come back to the ethical question. What's the obligation? How many hours a week are we obliged to work, or should we be obliged to work? And the magnitude of the change that we see in those experiments from the 70s and 80s, it's not clear that people were working so much less that it was a major economic or ethical problem. Experiments from the global south, like the one that I mentioned that took place in Madhya Pradesh, there I'm generalizing with all the caveats that come with that, but certainly in the Madhya Pradesh case, we saw a positive effect on economic activity. People basically used the basic income to set up new small businesses, and they became more economically active as a result of that. I think you point to a whole cluster of important ethical and empirical issues, and of course we want the basic income to be sustainable. So, if it turns out not to be sustainable at a certain level, then we have to scale it back. But I think the evidence base we currently have is consistent with the direction of travel and moving forward and seeing what effects things have.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you for the question as well. I will go to you first. Wow, this is going to be an exercise. Hi guys, nice to meet you. All right, what's your name and what's your question?
My name is Crystal Hajar. My question is specifically about, first of all, thank you for the non-domination framework of the UBI. That's actually very useful for talking about this subject. But my question is specifically about the last point on the slide, which politics should not accept the economy as it is, and the link with domination. As UBI could be a solution for domination, it implies that we do live in a system that somewhat benefits from domination. I would say it thrives on domination, but there's degrees to that. With that in mind, what is A, the incentive of those in power to challenge that domination? And then B, what can we, the average people who live in that grind of having to work and be dependent on employers, do to challenge that domination? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So let's distinguish kind of three questions we might explore. So there's a question about what our values are, e.g. non-domination. There's a question about what kind of policies and institutions would better realize those values. And so in this lecture, I talked a lot about UBI. And then there's a third question, which is, okay, we think we need these institutions to realize our values. How do we get there politically? How do we get from A to B? Now, my book talks primarily about, if not overwhelmingly, about the first two questions. And I think what you're raising is the third. And in a way, what I want to do next is to write a book on that question. So I can only give you the a sort of sketch of an answer. And, you know, I think it comes down to social movements, and building associational power through things like trade unions. I don't think that, you know, we will get, I don't think that we're going to get these kinds of reforms just out of, you know, elite benevolence or elite enlightenment. We need popular mobilization to create the pressure for the elite to concede these changes. So in a way, I think it just sort of comes back to how do we build social movements, and I suppose with the idea of the promotive stance in relation to trade unions, what I'm thinking of is a way in which popular associations and social movements can interact with the state and use state resources to open up new possibilities. You know, with the idea of the promotive stance, the idea is that, you know, trade unions use their political influence to get changes in labour law and policy which promote the further growth of trade unionism. So that kind of model, I think, is maybe something we can extend to other kinds of popular association. But that's only the beginnings of a sketch of an answer. So maybe in 10 years I'll have another book, yeah. I mean, I guess what I would also add is, you know, an important political question is, what is the terrain, if you like, on which we're trying to do this? And the final chapter of the book talks about the idea of the Green New Deal as a kind of discourse space, a political space in the contemporary political world. And I do think a lot of this stuff has to try and situate itself there, both because, you know, climate change matters, something I didn't say anything about in my presentation, but it matters and we need things like the Green New Deal to deal with that challenge. But I guess the kind of energy and mobilization that's going into projects like the Green New Deal is where that energy is also something which I think can go into this kind of project. Yeah.
Thank you, Stuart. More questions? Yes, or I'm going to you. I'm sorry, man. What's your name and what's your question?
Hi, my name is Minna, and my question, I think, touches a bit upon the last question, but also on the Green Deal, I guess. So to what extent do you think the UBI or policy, things like that, are address the structural problems of our current system and are not just like the symptom control of our current system?
Sorry, I didn't get the last bit of that. The symptom of control.
Yeah, so like I think with the Green Deal, it comes from like the will to like control climate change, but in essence, it still draws upon the concept of economic growth in that sense. Yeah. So to what extent does UBI form a structural solution? And to what extent is it like a symptom control of the current system? Oh,
symptom control, got it, okay. Yeah, well, I think, so on UBI, I mean, I think in one sense, it is very important as a fundamental structural reform. I think, you know, capitalism as a system depends on what I call basic needs vulnerability. It depends on having people who need to scramble into jobs. And a UBI fundamentally changes social relations insofar as it means that people are no longer in that kind of, under that pressure to scramble into jobs. But of course, there I am thinking about the UBI as in that sort of utopian long-term version where it's at a level sufficient to meet a set of basic needs. And I'm also assuming it's going to be complemented by public services and so on. So it's not sort of sufficient for that structural change. But I think, you know, why I'm interested in it is that I think it does have the potential to be that fundamental, or part of that fundamental structural reform. More generally, I think, you know, if we take something like the Green New Deal, that can be understood in a way that requires fundamental structural reform, or it can be understood in the sort of more conservative way that you were indicating. So I think something like the Green New Deal and maybe UBI too, we should see these things as sites of political contestation, right? So they could be symptoms of control, they could be fundamental structural reforms, which they are, to which extent they're one or the other, is itself going to be a matter of ongoing political contestation. So the Green New Deal idea, yeah, there are versions of the Green New Deal where, you know, it's understood in a way that's we're assuming continued economic growth, but in a much greener way. There are also versions of the Green New Deal that are closer to ideas of degrowth, and which in that sense are more radical. So I think, you know, symptom of control or genuine structural reform, they can be either. It's kind of up for political contestation, I think. Yeah.
More questions. We have about 5 minutes left. Just a thing to keep in mind while asking your question, and Stuart, maybe in answering
in giving my answer, yeah.
But take your time, of course, that you need. Hi, what's your name? I know that you know your name is Lucas. I know you. What's your question?
I see. Hi, thank you for your, I think, great ideas for a fair economy. And I think a lot of it is something we can experiment with and be it in a more step-by-step manner. So an issue I think a lot of parties, mostly on the right-wing side, call for these kind of ideas is that if we move toward a more fair economy and the countries around us are not those experimenting with this, that we kind of have that dilemma of being the first and being the one that is experimenting with it, and therefore making our country more attractive maybe for other people. And how would you deal with that dilemma, which is something that would make experimenting with these kinds of ideas pretty hard?
Yeah, good question. So, of course, one thing we can think about is different levels at which we might try and do these sorts of changes. So there's a kind of national level. Maybe there are things we can do subnationally and regionally and locally, but then there's a national level, transnational. I mean, you know, you are luckily still members of the European Union in this country, so the EU is a sort of political unit that might be able to do something transnationally. There are certainly proposals for an EU-wide UBI. And we can also think globally. There are proposals for a global basic income, probably set at a very low level relative to a standard, a poverty threshold in the Netherlands. But I think we need to sort of work at all of those levels and be ambitious at all of those levels. I mean, I think in your question there's also I think, a question about immigration. And I think from a Republican point of view, from a non-domination point of view, there's an enormous amount that's wrong with our international migration system. And I mean, it's politically challenging, but I think we just have to face the political challenge of trying to build a fair economy and a more just global immigration system, acknowledging that may mean higher levels of immigration for the Netherlands or the UK. The far right won't like that, but I think that's the challenge we face. If you're thinking about this in terms of republicanism and non-domination, because the migration system we have now imposes all kinds of horrible forms of domination on people.
We have time for one more question. Who dares? I'm climbing over you. I'm sorry. What's your name and what's your question?
Hello.
Hi.
I am Thomas. I wanted to ask you, your talk supposes, if I understand it correctly, that domination is bad. And I'm not sure I agree here, but by means of, so two quick examples. Say there is somewhere a big fire and the police closes the street. Then I cannot enter the street because the police basically has some domination so that I cannot enter the street. But there is a fire, and I think it's a very good thing that in this case the police can say, well, you can't go here, although they implement themselves, like basically. And second example, well, when I was a kid, my parents would have a domineering relationship over me, which is a very good thing, because I was a little bastard and I would do stuff which I wasn't supposed to do. So, I hope you get generally the question. There are some cases in which domination, I think, is very useful. And
for bastards.
Well, but also in the sense of the police saying you can't go here because. So.
You think you can
Is
answer that,
domination about? So I think. Sorry, I was moving the slides there because I did have a slide which is sort of. I thought it's sort of connected to this, but it's okay. I can answer without the slide. So I think what your question points to is that the Republican doesn't want to say that authority is bad as such. They want to make a distinction between legitimate authority or legitimate power and this thing called domination. And that's where the notion of the power being arbitrary and uncontrolled comes in. So to take your police example, you know, if the police are exercising that power under a set of rules that are commonly understood, that have been made through an appropriate competitive, contestable political process, if you've got rights where you can, appeal what the police did if you think they overstepped their powers, then you're subject to authority, but you're not dominated. You're not being subject to an arbitrary, uncontrolled power of interference, which is what the Republican doesn't want. Again, think of Trump. Gets up in the morning, feels like it, slaps a tariff on this country, rings up that broadcasting company and tells them to sack a comedian he doesn't like. And then in the evening, he removes the tariff. It's the willfulness, the lack of accountability, controllability that's constitutive of domination rather than authority.
And what a way to explain the difference between Republican and Republican in the end. Stuart, thank you so much for coming here. A warm applause for Stuart White.
Thank you.
Also, of course, a big thank you to Ingrid Robeyns and the Visions for the Future project by the University of Utrecht. The 13th of March, there is another evening about Muskism, so please do come to that. It's going to be very interesting. And before you go, I have one last question for you. Oh, I'm going to skip to all these slides. Please be patient. We would really love to know what we can do better during these programs. So if you have the time, please take a minute to scan this QR code to let us know what you thought. And hopefully we'll see you next time.